Hi guys, so I'm here today to talk to you about my clinical review activity for my behavior change project. So my project was to implement the picture exchange communication system, also known as the PEC system, for an 8-year-old child who has limited functional communication. So the client that I used for this project, his name is Elliot, and he again is an 8-year-old boy who is diagnosed with autism and a seizure disorder. Elliot was diagnosed with autism in another state, and we were shown proof of the documentation of his diagnosis. In Elliot's home, he lives with his mother, his father, and his sister, as well as the seizure dog. And the seizure dog has been trained to recognize his seizures and alert his family members, or also be with Elliot during those seizures. And he's also on a prescribed medication to help control his seizures. For Elliot, he attends a regular education program at his school, his elementary school, and he's in a regular education classroom. He does have a paraprofessional who does assist him with his classwork, and he is able to attend all of his classes, including exploratories such as gym and art. Elliot attends school every day, so he is not on a restricted schedule at all. And the problem behavior that we are targeting with this intervention was to decrease his verbal outbursts when asked to engage in a non-preferred activity when he got home from school. So the setting for this intervention took place in Elliot's home, and Elliot typically plays in his bedroom or in the family room. He does have preferred activities and toys in both rooms, but he typically likes to bring his toys and including his iPad, which is a preferred activity, down to the family room to play. So a definition of Elliot's behavior, which is verbal outbursts, would be defined as screaming, yelling, hitting, or crying in an aggressive manner directed at the person giving the direction to participate in the non-preferred activity. So an example of a verbal outburst for Elliot would be when his mother directs him to clean his bedroom. He spits and screams and yells at her for a long period of time. A non-example of his behavior would be if he were playing on his iPad and was screaming at the game. It's difficult to determine if that would necessarily be a verbal outburst for him, but for this purpose of this intervention, it wouldn't be, because he's not being given a direction, and that screaming could be due to excitement. So the measurement system that I used for my intervention was frequency, and we used that to determine how often Elliot engaged in a verbal outburst, and we tallied the frequency of his verbal outbursts per 15-minute sessions. And during the intervention, Elliot's mother and I both collected frequency data for 15 minutes during each session on days when we collected inter-observer agreement. And reliability was calculated on the number of times that Elliot engaged in a verbal outburst during a session. Inter-observer agreement was based on how many times Elliot screamed, yelled, cried, or spit during a verbal outburst. And we used total count inter-observer agreement to determine the percent. And inter-observer agreement overall was calculated to be 96%. For baseline data collection, Elliot's parents continued to do the same things that they were doing. They do have some experience with behavioral intervention, so they would often ignore his behavior, but after a certain number of verbal outbursts, it became very difficult for them to not give in. So they did often give in to giving him his preferred activity, even if he didn't complete the non-preferred activity. So during baseline, Elliot's mother was the primary person who collected data, and she collected data for 15 minutes when she would give him a non-preferred activity if he engaged in a verbal outburst. She would give him the direction as usual, and then she would tally how often he engaged in that verbal outburst for 15 minutes. So during his intervention, we introduced the picture exchange system for Elliot to help communicate functionally, but we also wanted him to understand if-then. So what we first did was I collected a preference inventory on Elliot to determine what would be a high reinforcer for him, as well as what certain things he really gravitated towards. So after I completed that preference inventory, it was determined that toys such as his iPad and cars were a high value reinforcer for Elliot. I then implemented the picture exchange with Jennifer. We created it. We used pictures that were normally around his house, so such as cleaning up his bedroom or making his bed or putting away his clothes or taking out the trash, things that Jennifer typically has Elliot do at home. We made pictures for those, and then we also made pictures for his preferred activities, so the iPad and the cars and the computer, and we made a pegboard for him. So each day when Elliot got home, Jennifer would implement the PEC system by showing him the first he would complete this, and then he can choose a preferred activity. When Elliot engaged in that verbal outburst, the person recording the data began to tally how many instances Elliot screamed, yelled, spit, or cried in a 15-minute interval. When Elliot was calm, the directions were repeated to Elliot. Elliot, when you're calm, first this, then you can do blank. When Elliot calmed down enough to do the required task, he was able to choose a preferred activity to engage in for 20 minutes. And a timer was set to give Elliot a visual, so his mother could also let him know, hey, Elliot, you have 10 more minutes, and then we'll have to do this, or you have 5 more minutes, and then we'll have to do this, just to help prepare him for that transition to participate in that next non-preferred activity. When Elliot engaged in a verbal outburst during his preferred activity, then he would lose the remaining time on his activity. And he was also shown his PECS board and verbally told that he lost his activity for engaging in a verbal outburst. Elliot was then showed that he had to complete another non-preferred activity before he could be rewarded with another preferred activity. When I was working with Jennifer, we wanted to make sure that the PEC system was clearly implemented and that she completely understood how to implement the PEC system. In other studies, video modeling was used, and unfortunately I was unable to do a video modeling with her, but we did do modeling with each other and practice implementing the PEC system before she implemented it with her son. And when we were completing treatment fidelity, we used a checklist to determine that each step was mastered before we moved on to the next. Jennifer does have some experience in this, so she was able to master the PEC system with 100% accuracy. The experimental design that I used was an AB experimental design. So during all baseline collection, parents intervened with Elliot's verbal outbursts as they've already been doing. And during intervention, we used the PEC system and introduced along with preferred reinforcements for compliance during non-preferred activities. So when we're talking about behavioral maintenance and generalization, we have not been able to generalize this PEC system yet to his school district. There is talk about doing that. Jennifer is very interested in having his teacher and his paraprofessional carry this over, just because it did work so well when we implemented it at home, and she would like to see that across the board. So she has actually set up a meeting with his teacher, paraprofessional, principal, and school, and as well as the school psychologist and behavioralist for the district, so they can set up a plan to implement this effectively. As well as implementing it at the school, Jennifer and her husband also wanted to be on the same page with implementing the PEC system. They work different schedules, so it's at times difficult for them to be together to see how this works. So we did set up a time to talk with Jennifer and her husband to make sure that they're both on the same page with implementing the PEC system correctly for Elliot. And I also emphasize that the parents really need to follow the intervention step by step and to not skip any steps in order for the intervention to be as effective as possible. So based on the results from Elliot's PECS implementation, he was able to increase his functional communication to let us know what his wants and needs were, and as well as decrease his outbursts. And as you can see from my graph, this shows his verbal outbursts. This was during baseline, and then the steadily decreasing of verbal outbursts during intervention. And we just wanted to make sure that it's definitely effective intervention. So then if you see during baseline again, there were fewer during the original baseline, but he still had quite a few verbal outbursts. And then towards the end, he was starting to decrease with his verbal outbursts. So it's just showing that his intervention was being effective and he was able to communicate his wants and needs in an effective manner, but also to decrease his frustrations with not being understood or not getting his wants and needs. So some limitations to the PECS exchange system, especially in this setting, is that several studies have shown that PECS are not effective in a group setting, which is kind of concerning, especially because there are a few other children who utilize PECS in Elliot's classes, and if they wanted to implement this system, they wouldn't be able to do it as a group setting. So we just need to do some more research as professionals to determine whether or not PECS would be effective and collect more data for a group setting. And as well as making sure that it would be effective in a group setting, it needs to be effective for the individual. So one study I actually read talked about using a psychological diagnostic tool to determine the individual's cognitive and developmental level. And that's not something I did with Elliot, but that's definitely something to take into consideration. I did, based off of what Jennifer had told me and what I'd read through Elliot's medical records, I determined that he was able and he could definitely implement and learn the PEC system. But for some children, the PEC system would not be effective if they're not able to master the understanding of how to use it and how to make those choices. So that's just definitely something I would probably include in the future, is using a psychological tool to determine if they could functionally, use the PEC system. And as one last thing that definitely I included in here was training. Jennifer has had experience with the PEC system, and she also knows her son better than anyone else. So she was fantastic at implementing it. But if we do want to generalize the PEC system to different settings and for different individuals, there really needs to be a great training process involved. And I would recommend that video modeling or using others as models, because that was effective for my intervention, was for Jennifer and I to model it with each other so she could fully grasp how to implement the PEC system. But if she were to implement it within his school, we would want to make sure that the teachers were well trained on his system and that they were following the intervention step by step so that we're making sure it's very effective across the board. So that's my clinical review for my behavior change project, and I'm glad to share it with you guys.